Good afternoon. My name is Szymon Lipiński. I will be one of your hosts today. And the session of today's webinar is CBAM in 2026, the challenges and cross-border compliance. I will discuss briefly what has changed in the definite period of CBAM and what we've learned in the transitional period. What is the impact on EU compliance and reporting? What is the non-EU perspective and global trade consequences? How CBAM influences supply chain, customs, and operations, and what companies should do now. I'm joined today by fellow CBAM experts, Jamie MacLeod, Director of Customs and International Trade Department in Crow UK, and Tessa Hendrickson, Senior Indirect Tax Manager in Crow Federer in the Netherlands. Before we proceed, we'd like to ask you a few questions about your CBAM readiness for the definite period. You should be seeing the survey now. If you could take just a minute to fill in the survey, we're basically asking what is the biggest challenge for you in implementation of CBAM regulations, and how do you think your organization is exposed to CBAM? I will remain silent for a minute and let you fill in the survey. So we're still getting the results, and they're quite interesting. I will share the results with you once we have all the responses. So just additional 30 seconds for you. Okay, I think we have all the responses. I'm going to close the survey. I will share the results with you now. I think some of them are quite interesting. So you believe that the biggest challenge right now for your organization is understanding the data and reporting requirements. Only a few participants said that the contractual and pricing impacts are the biggest challenge. And of course, some of you don't know where to start. We'll be happy to help with that today. And most of the organizations believe that the biggest CBAM exposure is for the direct EU importers of CBAM goods. So I think we may return to the presentation and continue with our session. So initially, we'd like to highlight what's new in 2026 and what we've learned in the transitional period. We'll start with the key updates in the CBAM regulations. We know that the learning phase is now over, and we know most of the regulations for the definitive phase of CBAM. Some provisional CBAM benchmarks and the default values for the definite period have also been published. There are also new regulations regarding the way of calculating the embedded emissions, And based on these regulations, some of the processes that in the transitional period were subject to CBAM emission calculations are now out of scope of CBAM. And this includes the finishing treatment operations, such as plating, cutting, and welding. As I've mentioned, most of the regulations for the definitive CBAM period have already been published. We're still waiting for the CBAM certificates regulation, the regulation on carbon prices paid in third countries, and the regulation on annual CBAM declaration. What is the most important is the possible CBAM extension. The European Commission has published a draft regulation expanding the scope of CBAM to additional 180 categories of goods. These new categories of goods are downstream goods made of simpler CBAM goods, the goods that are currently subject to CBAM. And these include metal components, machinery and equipment, vehicles and vehicle parts, furniture, and modular structures. Now, speaking of the biggest challenges in CBAM compliance and reporting, we must first identify what the compliance in CBAM right now is. So, first of all the importers of CBAM goods must apply for the authorized CBAM declarant status. The application must be made before importing CBAM goods. Secondly, the importers must submit annual CBAM declaration. We no longer submit the quarterly reports, but provide the embedded emissions data and the data on volume of imported goods in the annual CBAM declaration. This declaration will of course serve as the basis for surrendering the CBAM certificates. And the CBAM certificates must be first purchased. The purchase price of the CBAM certificates will depend on the average weekly EU ETS price. However, there are some adjustments for the first year of the definitive phase. And in the first quarter of this year, importers may still continue importing CBAM goods without the authorized declarant status, provided that they file the application for CBAM authorization by the end of March. So a couple of days left. If you haven't submitted the application yet, please do so now. When it comes to the prices of CBAM certificates to be purchased for 2026, this will be based on a quarterly EU ETS average price. The publication of the relevant price is set to be on the 7th of April this year for the first quarter of 2026. Also, the certificates for 2026 will be sold and purchased by the importers retroactively after the beginning of February 2027. So, having that in mind, we see some major compliance challenges. First of all, not all of our clients manage to get the actual emissions data from their suppliers. It is, of course, now possible to apply the default value emissions. However, application using these emissions will ultimately lead to higher CBAM certificate costs, as we will show in a few minutes. Secondly, even if the non-EU operators provide CBAM emissions data, that data is rarely complete or meets the CBAM regulations quality standards. Usually, some of the most important data on embedded emissions in the precursors used while manufacturing CBAM goods is missing. Lastly, the risk of misclassification occurs. Our clients may classify the goods differently than their non-EU counterparts. And there is a risk of classifying goods as non-EU goods by the non-EU suppliers. Of course, this risk can materialize in CBAM sanctions. The sanctions in the transitional CBAM period, as you may recall, were only up to 50 euro per emission ton. Currently, it's more than 400 euro per emission ton of the imported goods. These sanctions will typically be imposed on importers who fail to submit CBAM declarations, fail to surrender the correct value of certificates, and what is most important, on those importers who try to artificially avoid the CBAM obligations where the anti-circumvention provisions may apply. So from the business risk perspective, importers must now include the direct CBAM certificate costs that are related with the CBAM certificate value, the compliance exposure, namely the sanctions, and the supply chain mapping and supplier onboarding. Speaking of the costs, we've calculated the average planned CBAM charges that may apply depending on the type of data source that you plan to use. And as you can see in this table, if the default values are used, the CBAM certificate charge will be significantly higher than if the actual emission values were used. Typically, the difference is twice as high as for the actual emission values. As you can see, the highest difference is for the Chinese aluminium. However, in some cases, we've seen that the suppliers from non-EU countries provide emissions data that is closely related, similar to the default emission values. This may imply that the non-EU suppliers actually do not calculate the emission values, but use the default emission factors. This may, of course, lead to a risk of incorrectly reducing the emission values should the non-EU operators use a different or not correct default emission factors. And based on that, we've identified several best practices for the EU importers. The starting point is always mapping the supply chain. Without understanding your supply chain and knowing where the main emission sources are, you cannot comply with CBAM effectively. You will be faced with the default value charges that are 4 times higher than if you could apply the actual emission values. So mapping the supply chain is always a starting point. You should also establish a robust compliance procedure, and that procedure must be documented. The documentation must accompany this application for CBAM authorization. The CBAM authority that verifies the application will review the CBAM compliance procedure to confirm that you have the operational capacity to meet the CBAM regulation obligations. It seems also vital to implement a structured data collection approach. Using the simple tools that were provided by the European Commission in the past, or the Excel spreadsheet, may not suffice now. You need to collect data from different sources, from the non-EU operators, from the customs hubs. Use of some standardized software for data management and maintaining CBAM records is vital. Of course, the prices of CBAM certificates themselves depend on the EU ETS regulations. So you must monitor these regulations, and you must monitor the EU ETS allowance prices. And lastly, it is vital to engage early on with your suppliers from outside the European Union to guide them through the process of CBAM compliance, to let them understand what is required from them, and of course also make it clear in the contracts that these regulations also apply to them and they must comply with that. Speaking on the suppliers and non-EU perspective, I believe we have one of the best experts in this field, and I'm sure that my colleague Jamie will be able to elaborate on the non-EU perspective and their challenges. Jamie, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much, Szymon, for that overview. I think every time I go on one of these webinars myself, I realise there is and reminded again that there's no such thing as simplicity when it comes to CBAM, unfortunately, especially now we are in the definitive phase. I think sometimes it's easy to forget that CBAM started 2.5 years ago. We have been on this journey for a while now, but since the beginning of the year, the materiality and importance of understanding your role in the supply chain as a business has increased dramatically. And that's what I'm going to look at for the next 15 minutes or so, is focusing on the non-EU perspective. But I think what you'll find, and certainly what I found when putting these slides together, is it's very difficult to look at CBAM from one single perspective. There's so many different stakeholders. I'm going to be using words like suppliers, producers, installations. They all can mean different things and different things to different people. But there's so many different actors in the CBAM supply chain who have different roles when it comes to what they're expected to do. Particularly, I think, over the last couple of years, just looking at what we've seen, the Commission maybe is focused on the EU end importer and the third country operator, sometimes easily forgetting that there's this significant group of people in the middle, distributors, stakeholders, stockholders, all sorts of different actors within the CBAM supply chain. So I'm going to focus on the exporter perspective, but bear in mind that can encompass several different groups of businesses. And I'll try and pick up on some of the nuances as we go through. So just initially, to elaborate on that point, I think it is always worth reiterating that the fundamental legal obligation for CBAM, the actor who really has to comply fully and submit CBAM reports, as Shimon alluded to, and buy the CBAM certificates, is the EU importer, or there's this nuance around, in some cases, that's the indirect customs representative, and we'll get to that. But fundamentally, the compliance obligation is with the EU importer. But compared to the customs world, for example, where the EU importer, mostly it's within their own gift to be fully compliant. They can determine the classification, the value, the origin. They're making those declarations and they have that information available. Compared to that world, CBAM operates almost entirely differently. So whilst the obligation legally is still with the EU importer, the importer is almost entirely dependent on their supply chain to support their compliance with CBAM. And I think even in the transitional period, that's where we saw real challenges for EU importers engaging with their full supply chain in order to get actual data. That's being by far the biggest challenge, and then use that data to be compliant themselves, submit their own reports. That was challenging enough in the transitional phase where everyone was learning. Now we're in the definitive phase where the ability to get actual data or not is going to have dramatic, in some cases, differences in what gets paid and what has to be paid for CBAM. We're in a new world now. So EU importer fully reliant on their supply chain in order to provide them with actual data, allow them to be compliant. Yes, they could still use default values that we'll cover, but in order for them to be compliant, but also limit their CBAM exposure financially, and the cost could potentially be extremely significant where default values are used, they have to engage with their supply chain. So we know, as Shimon said, default values are available, and Shimon gave some helpful examples. I would just stress, though, that the outcomes of using default values can change dramatically by product, so by specific commodity code, and also by country of origin as well. So to fully understand the default value that would apply for an EU importer, you have to understand classification for commodity code, and you have to understand the origin, and that can produce some extremely varied outcomes as well. So default values in all cases are punitive. They're deliberately set high by the Commission. So we want to avoid having to use those as an EU importer. But as an exporter to the EU, I need to hopefully work to allow my customer to use actual data and therefore pay less, because that will always, nearly always, be a much lower emissions value than the default value. So that availability of data, being able to obtain data, or if I'm an exporter, provide data to my EU customer, is increasingly going to become a crucial aspect of remaining commercially competitive, and to continue to ultimately be able to win business for EU customers. That's going to be a key criteria for how EU customers benchmark their suppliers going forward, is are they CBAM ready? So that's what we're going to look at in a bit more detail. So those exporters who are able to do that and demonstrate their readiness, maybe not right now, but the quicker you're able to do that going forward, are going to be much better placed to continue to supply their EU customers. Just one very practical point I wanted to cover first, however, is what we call the DDP challenge. So historically, many non-EU businesses, exporters of CBAM goods to the EU, may have agreed deliver duty paid DDP Incoterms with their EU customers. And that's where the EU customer says, you deliver the goods to my door. I don't want any involvement with the freight, insurance, customs declarations at all. Clearly, that's always generally what EU customer will want, but quite often for EU exporters, they have to agree with those terms if they want to be competitive, if they want to win the business. So historically, EU exporters of CBAM goods, quite often, many would agree to DDP terms, and they were able to manage selling goods into the EU and managing the EU import customs obligations themselves. The problem we have now with the need to be an authorized CBAM declarant is a non-EU business is not able to do that. One of the key criteria to be an authorized declarant for CBAM is establishment in the EU. So if a UK business is not established in the EU, they cannot become an authorized declarant. They therefore cannot anymore import their goods into the EU on a DDP basis. So this has come up as quite a challenge for a number of exporters to the EU. Some of the solutions available, really the only three solutions available, is can you switch Incoterms? So every other Incoterm, which are international commercial terms around who does what in international sales transactions, every other term, including DAP, delivered at place, indicates that the buyer has to manage the customs obligations and therefore the CBAM obligations. So if you're able to renegotiate those terms as an exporter, that's what you should do. And then you're placing the legal obligation for CBAM on the importer. You still need to support them in the way that we're going to discuss. So switching Incoterms can help. The other option is to use an indirect customs representative who is established in the EU. So whereby the customs broker will take on the CBAM obligations. Now, understandably, at the moment, very few customs brokers offer that service. It implies risk for them. They will pay the costs, so they will need to provision for that. So it's challenging, but increasingly maybe we'll see that as a service offering for non-EU businesses for CBAM goods. And the final option is to look to establish in the EU, be it set up a subsidiary and a legal entity with some substance which would qualify to be an authorized CBAM declarant, and you can import goods into the EU through that entity and then sell goods onward to EU customers. So there's options available, but that's one of the immediate challenges we've seen and been speaking to businesses about over the last year or so, are exporters from outside the EU currently sell to the EU on a DDP basis and just cannot do that anymore. And it links to the point that Shimon made around just for authorized CBAM declarant status in general. If you're just an EU importer, if you're on that side of things, and you haven't been authorized, that has to be the number one objective. From the end of this month, we're going to see a much harsher enforcement at the border of the authorized declaration, authorized declarant requirement. Okay, so going back to the pricing and contract and commercial aspect that I alluded to earlier, for non-EU exporters of goods to the EU, what we're increasingly seeing are contracts including CBAM clauses in sales contracts. So covering things like the emissions data that has to be provided and by when, the CBAM costs and how those are passed through and going to be absorbed, that's still definitely being played out. And terms on different outcomes. So on whether the importer has to use default values if you cannot, as the seller, provide them with actual data, because the costs can be wildly different. Some of the things that can help when we're speaking to businesses and they're engaging with their suppliers in the Far East, for example, some of those producers of CBAM goods are looking at things like pre-verification. How can they, for example, give assurance throughout this year that they do have a monitoring plan in place? They have already started to engage with someone who they expect to be an accredited CBAM verifier. When in 2027 are they able to share actual data? If you have producers and suppliers of CBAM goods who are able to answer those questions, that's what you want to hear at the moment. If you're met with blank faces, then that's a problem. But I would also, link to that, be very wary of any supplier or producer of CBAM goods who says, yep, here's my emissions data, and gives you some kind of report with some sort of stamp on it. That's not possible. It is not possible to have verified actual CBAM emissions data until 2027 at the earliest. So there's certainly been businesses we've spoken to who have said, yep, my supplier's already told me they're CBAM compliant, they have their verified data. I'd be extremely cautious if you're being told things like that. And just on the final point there, alluding to what I said earlier, is we do have this really significant groups of businesses in the middle of the CBAM supply chain, so not between the producers and the end EU importer. And for them, if I'm an EU importer, I may be buying from one of those distributors. I need to assess their readiness, but it's not in their gift. They're not the producer of the goods. They need to in turn assess the readiness of the installations who are actually producing the CBAM goods. So it goes back to this throughout the whole supply chain, having a value chain that's ready and understands the CBAM requirements and is able to provide actual data next year. And as you can already probably begin to tell, that's a real challenge to be able to ensure that verified data from all aspects of production firstly can be determined, collated, and passed throughout the supply chain. But you can put processes in place to make that happen. And ultimately, this is now becoming a commercial aspect in the sales of CBAM goods. An EU importer can, in theory, be fully CBAM compliant just by using default values. If they do that, they don't need to go to their supply chain for data. They don't need to understand the installation who produced the goods if they're using default values. And in reality, they may have to use the default values for a period of time. But increasingly, they will be looking for the suppliers who can say to them with confidence, I have actual data, verified data that I can supply you with as and when you need it on an annual basis. And those suppliers will absolutely be top of the list. They'd be top of my list if I was an EU importer importing CBAM goods, of who those businesses want to deal with because of the cost aspect. So gaps in emissions data and delays, the verification timing constraints. So, and this is linked to the final point around capacity, is if a business says, well, I think I might be able to get you verified data, but I can't tell you when. Well, I need to submit my CBAM report next year by September. I need to understand what certificates I need to buy really by February, March. So the timing aspect is crucial here. And that final aspect is around capacity is also really important. So the EU Commission has received a lot of feedback in recent weeks around the verification requirements. So those requirements are stringent. They require in year one a physical site visit. There's a huge amount of businesses, tens if not hundreds of thousands of producers that need to have their data verified. How possible is that going to be? Is there the capacity amongst verifiers to be able to do that? And the likelihood at the moment is that there isn't. So those producers and exporters who engage early and will be able to hopefully get their goods verified. Those who wait, unfortunately, there's unlikely to be the capacity available to meet the demand. So as an EU importer, what they're assessing from their exporters and supplier base is, are they taking action now to at least put in place the procedures to go and get verified at the beginning of next year? If not, the alternative is the default values, and that commercial impact is then felt. If you're an exporter to the EU and you can't provide actual data or can't provide any kind of indication of assurance that in 6 months, a year, 18 months, you're going to be able to do that. Increasingly, you're likely ultimately to lose business, or at best have to work off worsened commercial terms. So what can exporters do now? It's absolutely treat this as a commercial reality. Like I said, the EU importer can get by, but not in a way that's commercially appealing to them or you. So ensuring that you can explain, I think that first point is maybe a bit of a typo, because like I said, you can't have emissions data, verified data now, but you can hopefully give an indication of, through the pre-verification aspect I mentioned, well, actually, we've been monitoring for 3 months, we're on our monitoring plan, and we think we're going to end up with an emissions value of X. That will give your customer a real indication to allow them to benchmark you in terms of emissions intensity, what you're working towards. So being able to explain, here are the processes we're putting in place in order to get actual verified data, and when you expect from the beginning of next year to be able to provide actual verified data. That early engagement, and even now just being seen as someone who has an idea of what is being discussed even, will set you apart as a business compared to many exporters at the moment of CBAM goods who just aren't there at all on this journey at the moment. And just to make that point again, finally, on if you are a business selling on DDP terms and you've managed to get away with that in the first quarter of this year, we have heard cases absolutely of goods being stopped at the border, and customs authorities in the EU asking for evidence of, can you prove to me either you're an authorized CBAM declarant or that you've applied to be an authorized CBAM declarant. There may still have been some leeway in the first quarter of this year. The EU have said by the end of March, we'll give a bit of breathing room. But if by the end of March, an EU importer doesn't have or hasn't applied to be an authorized declarant, there is likely to be a significant blockage at the border, and worst case goods being sent back from next week. Okay, so it would be wrong of me as the UK representative on the webinar to not discuss UK CBAM. I think just overall, going back to the essence of CBAM and the beginning of CBAM, is that this is an entirely experimental, revolutionary measure. This is the EU doing what it does quite well in terms of being quite bold with regulation and new regulation, aiming, of course, to contribute towards decarbonisation and avoiding carbon leakage. But over the past 2.5 years, what's become clear is that CBAMs in general are here to stay. The EU has diluted much of its other sustainability regulations. It hasn't diluted CBAM. CBAMs are here to stay. UK is the next country in line to confirm that absolutely we will introduce a CBAM. Other countries are already seriously discussing it. Taiwan, Australia, Turkey, Canada, off the top of my head, plenty of other countries are doing that because they'd rather take the money from themselves, and also looking at introducing their own domestic carbon pricing. So it is actually having the desired effect. It's had a huge impact already, and the UK was the first country to definitively follow suit and say we are introducing our own CBAM as well. So UK CBAM goes live next year, so we're 1 year behind EU CBAM in the UK. We won't, however, have any kind of transitional period. I think the UK has said, well, people understand what this thing is now because there was a two-year EU transitional period. So UK CBAM will be straight into the real thing from January next year. The UK government throughout this year will be rolling out legislation to confirm exactly how UK CBAM will operate, and guidance. That's been happening already. And as we get closer towards the end of the year, those activities will really ramp up. The UK has decided to flip things around to compare to the EU. So with EU CBAM, we went from quarterly reports in the transitional period to annual reports in the definitive period. We're doing things the other way around. UK CBAM will start with an annual report and then move to quarterly reporting. And what we're really encouraging UK businesses to do now is assess the potential impact through reviewing your customs data. So we do have an advantage over many of our European colleagues in that in the UK we have excellent customs data. Any business can, as of next week, go to a self-service portal and for free download their customs reports. You can authorize people like me to look at those reports as well and download them for you. So that's our immediate advice at the moment for UK CBAM. You have to look at your reports for last year and start looking at what you think the impact will be. And just finally, this is a positive. I know often with CBAM it can be a bit like being the bearer of bad news, but hopefully this is a bit of positive news in that the UK and EU have agreed politically to link their emissions trading schemes. So that was agreed last May, and the outcome of that is effectively we're saying if we align on how our emissions trading schemes operate and we have the same carbon price, then we can exempt each other from each other's CBAM. We did the same with sanctions where we said we have the same sanctions on Russia as you. Let's not apply those sanctions on goods moving between the UK and EU. It's the same principle of what we're doing here that the UK and EU have agreed politically. Now that still needs to be negotiated. Clearly EU CBAM is in force today and UK exporters are absolutely not exempt today. But if this is agreed and negotiations are now at the quite detailed stage, but unfortunately this can still take a lot of time, what that will mean is UK origin goods moving to the EU and EU origin goods moving to the UK will be fully exempt from each other's CBAM. The key point you'll have heard me say there is origin. So that full exemption will only apply to goods which originate and qualifies originating in either the UK and EU. But this is a positive, very much for now, just one to keep an eye on. It's not in force yet. It's been agreed as a framework, but we need to see the detail. Maybe 2027, maybe 2028, maybe later. Unfortunately, who knows? But it is being negotiated and one to keep an eye on. So hopefully that covers a bit of the exporter perspective for CBAM goods and the kind of things exporters of CBAM goods should be thinking about. The absolute crux of that being, are you and when and how are you able to supply your EU customers with actual data? That's going to be a key benchmark going forward, and then giving you a bit of a UK perspective as well. And now I'll hand over to my colleague Tessa from Crow Fodera to look at some of the more operational aspects of CBAM. Thanks, Tessa.
Thank you so much, Jamie, and welcome everyone. In this part of the webinar, we will look at CBAM from a supply chain, customs, and operational perspective. CBAM is not just a reporting obligation. It fundamentally changes how companies purchase, transport, declare, and collaborate with their logistics partners. And over the next 15 minutes, I will guide you through the key impact areas and the practical challenges that a lot of companies are currently facing. Before we look at the operational impact of CBAM, it's important to recognize that companies must now know exactly where the goods come from and how much emissions they contain. And in practice, this requires much closer collaboration between procurement, supply chain, customs teams, and especially suppliers. As already discussed, many suppliers still do not have the required emissions data or not in the right format, which immediately creates challenges in the supply chain. CBAM also has effect on customs processes. An accurate CN classification becomes critical. A wrong classification leads to wrong emissions data and mismatches between customs declarations and CBAM reports. A second point is system integration. Emissions data often sits in ECG systems, while import data is managed in ERP systems or broker platforms. And CBAM requires these to be connected to avoid manual work and reduce error risks. And this links to the third point, data quality. Any mistake, whether it's CN code, value, origin, or missing supplier information, it can result to CBAM non-compliance, penalties, or reputational damage. Finally, CBAM introduced a new cost component. Certificates, data collection, and internal controls all have financial impacts. CBAM is no longer just an environmental topic. It's now a core issue for supply chain, customs, and overall management. So on this slide, I want to briefly highlight how CBAM affects import structures and complex trade flows, an area where risks are often underestimated. So first, CBAM liability follows the physical import into the EU. Commercial arrangements such as who owns the goods or how invoicing is set up are irrelevant. If the goods physically cross the EU border, the importer of record is responsible. And this means that supply chain routing and customs decisions have a direct compliance impact. Second, many companies operate with complex import models, indirect imports, multi-step routes, or rerouting through different countries. And these structures do not reduce CBAM exposure because liability is still tied to physical entry. But what they do increase is documentation complexity and audit risks, as every additional party or routes makes it harder to prove the origin and to match the correct emissions data. A third point is liability and governance. When companies use indirect customs representation, responsibilities can shift or become unclear. And if contracts and service agreements do not explicitly define task and accountability, CBAM declarations may be incorrect while no one knows who is responsible for correcting them. Finally, CBAM requires proactive risk management. So that includes contractual clauses on data quality, monitoring the performance of logistics partners and customs brokers, and also clear escalation procedures. These measures help prevent compliance failures and limited financial exposure. So in summary, CBAM is not just a reporting obligation. It forces companies to reassess their import structures, their contracts, and the customs governance model. Then the role of logistics hubs and customs representatives. These hubs, ports, warehouses, and customs brokers, they are the operational points where goods physically enter the EU and where customs declarations are prepared. And that makes them critical control points in the CBAM process. Because CBAM, well, it relies heavily on timely and accurate emissions data. And if this data is not available before the import declaration is filed, companies risk incorrect CBAM reporting, delays, or even penalties. And ensuring smooth data flow to brokers and logistics partners is therefore essential. To manage this, companies increasingly adopt standard procedures, such as no data, no ship, or no data, no clearance. This ensures that emissions data is captured before goods are moved or declared. Finally, strong governance and control is needed. Contracts with customs brokers should include CBAM clauses and board preventive checks and detective controls, like validating data before submission and reconciling customs entries with CBAM reports. It can help reduce risks and maintain full compliance. So in short, logistics hubs and customs representatives are not just operational players. They are central to achieving reliable compliance. On this slide, I want to highlight how CBAM is driving companies to rethink their supply chain design. The first major impact is reducing carbon intensity. Companies are increasingly reviewing their supplier base and shifting toward lower emission producers because a cleaner footprint directly reduces CBAM costs. And this is now reflected also in procurement policy. Carbon intensity and CBAM exposure are becoming standard sourcing criteria alongside price, quality, and reliability. And procurement teams increasingly require verified emissions data upfront as part of the supplier selection. There's also a logistics dimension by optimizing transport routes, consolidating flows, or adjusting the logistic footprints. Companies can simplify CBAM compliance. Finally, supplier readiness becomes critical. Companies are introducing onboarding procedures and contractual clauses to ensure suppliers provide accurate emissions data on time, and this strengthens compliance and reduces operational risks. So in short, CBAM is reshaping sourcing, supplier relationships, and logistics. It's no longer just compliance. It's a strategic way to lower exposure and improve long-term competitiveness. On this slide, I want to highlight why governance is one of the most important elements of CBAM compliance. CBAM involves multiple functions across the organization, so role clarity is critical. And the hierarchy model helps define who is responsible, who is accountable, and who needs to be consulted or informed. And this ensures that tax, customs, ECG, procurement, legal, IT, logistic, and senior management each understand their specific CBAM duties. Second, the hierarchy model only works if it's embedded into the operating model. So that means integrating roles and responsibilities into day-to-day processes and linking them to internal controls. So procurement must know when to request emissions data, customs must validate CN codes, and ECG or tax teams must improve data before reporting. Finally, organizations need a robust control framework. Preventive controls such as supplier onboarding checks or system validations help prevent errors. And detective controls like reconciliations between customs data and CBAM reports ensures accuracy. Corrective controls allows issues to be escalated and fixed quickly. So in short, strong governance, a clear hierarchy model, and well-designed controls are essential to manage CBAM risk and ensure reliable, compliant reporting. If we go to the next slide, I would like to outline the main risks associated with CBAM and the controls companies need to manage them effectively. CBAM creates two distinct risk profiles. In the transition phase, the biggest challenge were data availability, correct emissions values, supplier readiness, and an accurate CN classification. Now, in the financial phase, the focus shifts to forecasting CBAM costs, certificate planning, and ensuring the accuracy of the final declarations. And these risks differ across the organization. Procurement faces supplier data risks. ECG teams face methodology and emissions accuracy risks. Customs deals with the classification and data matching risk, while others like tax, logistics, IT, and management each have their own specific exposure. CBAM is cross-functional, and gaps between departments are one of the biggest sources of compliance issues. And to mitigate these risks, companies they need strong internal controls. Governance controls ensure clear roles and ownership, and data validation controls verifying emission data, CN codes, and supplier information. On this slide, I would like to highlight the role of senior management in ensuring effective CBAM compliance. CBAM, it's not just an operational process. It impacts financial exposure, supplier performance, and also regulatory reporting. So strong leadership sponsorship is essential. Senior management sets the risk appetite, ensures that there's sufficient funding for system upgrades, for data integration, and also maybe internal control improvements. And the second component is a set of clear KPIs. These include data quality indicators, compliance metrics such as error rates, or reporting timeless and financial indicators like forecasted vs actual CBAM certificate costs. And these KPIs help management track performance, identify risks early, and steer organization toward reliable and efficient CBAM compliance. So in summary, senior leaderships and strong KPIs, they are crucial building blocks for CBAM oversight and long-term compliance. Then this slide shows the key takeaways of my part, what I just discussed regarding the supply chain, customs, and operational perspective. So first, CBAM has a strategic impact that goes far beyond compliance. It turns customs into a driver for sustainability, sourcing strategy, and cost management. And decisions about suppliers, routing, and emission intensity now have direct financial consequences. Second, companies must focus on getting the basics right, defining the correct scope, securing reliable emissions data from suppliers, and ensuring that this data is audit ready and aligned with ERP and custom systems. Third, CBAM introduces a new cost component. Companies will need to purchase CBAM certificates, forecast their exposure, and build those costs into budgeting and allocation models. This requires close coordination between departments like finance, tax, ECG, and procurement. Finally, strong governance and risk management are essential. Cross-functional collaboration, a clear hierarchy model, and a robust control frameworks, including data validation and reconsolidations, help prevent compliance failures and reduce financial and operational risks. So in summary, CBAM affects strategy, operations, finance, and governance. Organizations that prepare early will be better positioned to manage costs, ensure compliance, and turn CBAM into a competitive advantage. Then let me close with the last slide. What companies should do now? Well, get ready for CBAM. So settle CBAM obligations to certificates, check whether CBAM applies to your imports, be registered as an authorized CBAM declarant. Also ensure reliable emissions data chain with your suppliers, including standardized data formats, validating checks, and clear audit trail. Set up a process to ensure filing in time. And finally, from 2026, you must purchase and surrender CBAM certificates, understand the budget and cash flow impact, and embed CBAM into governance, internal controls, and management reporting. So in short, CBAM requires integrated governance, reliable data, financial weakness, and cross-functional alignment, tax, supply chain, and sustainability. So I think now we can continue with the Q&A.
Excellent. Thank you very much, Tessa. And we've had some excellent questions through, actually, and quite a few of them. So I know we've only got 5 minutes left. So I'm going to try and rattle through as many as I can. And I'll bring them up on the screen, hopefully, if this works. So there's a question here, which this is a great one because this touches on so many aspects of CBAM around origin, around emissions calculation, around goods moving back and forward. And this is a UK exporter who imports aluminium manufactured in the EU and then processed in the UK using renewable electricity and then exporting finished components back to the EU. So in that scenario, we did have a simplification as part of the recent omnibus package where EU precursor goods will not need to be reported if they are part of goods being re-exported to the EU. So that original aluminium, and I'm talking about a scenario where it sounds very much like the goods would change origin. So if, for example, you imported aluminium, held it in a warehouse, sent it back to the EU, that stays EU origin, no CBAM at all. That's nice and easy. When you import the precursor and turn it into a UK origin finished component, because of that simplification, we don't need to worry about the aluminium because that will have been subject to the EU ETS. When we talk about the electricity from your manufacturing process, as opposed to the transitional period where we had to report indirect emissions as a CBAM declarant, we no longer have to for aluminium, iron, steel products. So the indirect emissions, the emissions from the electricity relating to the production, are no longer required to be reported on. So that sounds like probably hopefully good news for you, but please email me because there's always specifics to look into in these kind of cases, but there may not be anything to report in that scenario. And that's a good example of origin being really important, exactly what processing is happening in the UK being really important, and also some of the more recent simplifications around CBAM where we've seen the goalpost move being really important as well. So hopefully that gives you a bit of an idea on that one. There's another really good one here around the kind of thing we've been talking about, around the middlemen effectively, and how you manage that process. There's not too much actual in the EU regulation and guidance around how they expect that process to be managed. The key requirement is, of course, around obtaining the verified installation data and then that being used to inform the CBAM report. The verified reports will have to be uploaded to the CBAM registry. So this is more a question, I think, of how internally your processes will ensure that there's a paper trail and documentation to connect the goods from those goods that were installed in that were produced in a factory in Taiwan or China or India or wherever it may be, and how can we show that those are the same goods that end up being reported on the final CBAM declaration. Just to try and get through a few more quickly here as well. There's a question around how EU CBAM costs relate with UK CBAM when it starts. I mean, both EU and UK CBAM, if we put linkage to one side, let's pretend that's not happening. Both CBAMs have a principle that you shouldn't pay a carbon price on the same emissions twice. So both UK and EU CBAM have mechanisms, and Shimon alluded to it in the beginning. The EU was still waiting on exact detail, but effectively in that case, you would deduct any carbon price that's already been paid depending on the supply chain there. So on UK CBAM, if I'm importing goods from the EU and there's been a carbon price already paid and the UK recognises that carbon price, and same vice versa, will deduct that price from the amount that's owing, and that's a fundamental principle of both UK and EU CBAM. A couple more quickly, we've still got a few more minutes. Who will do the pre-verification? And I think we'll take this as who will do the verification, because it's really the same question. Those verifiers, so those who are looking to be in the business of verifying CBAM emissions data, will have to be accredited by a national accreditation body. The EU has assigned who those bodies are in each EU country, but none of those bodies at this point are set up and running in terms of what that process for a verifier to be accredited looks like. Unfortunately, that looks like something that will be at the earliest the second half of this year, where on a one-by-one basis, each EU country will set out the process for, if you want to be a verifier of CBAM goods, here's how you come to me and say, and get accredited to be a verifier. So it's not something that anyone can just do. In reality, it will be a lot of the major companies who act as verifiers for the emissions trading scheme, SGS, people like that. There'll be, I think there's 120 companies who are currently accredited to do verification under the ETS, but we will not know who those companies will be until later in the year, unfortunately. And one final question, I think we'll get to this one, quite a specific one around CBAM liability, but it's a good one because it affects several principles here. CBAM liability relating to exports to Turkey from the UK that may pass through the EU. It's a good question because, again, it's another example of how inherently tied CBAM is to customs processes. If those goods pass through the EU in terms of transit, so they are under the transit procedure and do not enter EU free circulation, then there'll be no CBAM requirement, at least until Turkey implement their own CBAM at some point down the line. But just one really important point relating to that, to both EU and UK, CBAM only applies when goods are declared to free circulation in the EU, and that will be the same in the UK. So there are customs special procedures like customs warehousing if you just store goods and re-export them, or inward processing if you import goods to process them and re-export them, which if you use those authorizations will completely mitigate the CBAM impact. So that's something we're definitely going to be talking about more on the UK side, and in the EU side it's as pertinent. If you're a business who imports goods, either holds them or processes them, and then a percentage of those goods are re-exported, then absolutely you need to be looking at customs special procedures like inward processing, like customs warehousing, because they can at least partially, or maybe even fully in some cases, take you out of the CBAM picture and mitigate CBAM. So something definitely to think about around the kind of ways that you can mitigate your CBAM obligations. So hopefully that was helpful. I think we've come to the end of the hour now. Thank you very much to everyone that's joined, and please don't hesitate to reach out to any of us as presenters if you have any more questions. If there are any questions we haven't got to, we will absolutely reply to you as well. But thank you very much for joining.